This is Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast, episode number 31.
Embarrassing moment, culture insights, proven methods to achieve Chinese fluency. Skip that learning curve with the Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast. Now, your host, Victor Yang.
Hello everyone, Victor Yang here and welcome to Journey to Chinese Fluency. Today I am joined by Hannah Jackson. Hannah comes from the United Kingdom. Hannah has studied Chinese for 4 years and lived in China for 5 years. She's now living in London and works for the Body Shop. And here's one interesting fact. She has a 6-month-old puppy called Snoop. I think that's pretty funny. Let's welcome our guest for today. 你好 Hannah, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much.
Are you ready to share with us your journey to Chinese fluency?
Yes, 当然.
Awesome. First of all, please feel free to help our audience to learn more about you. Please tell us a bit more about your background.
Sure. So I grew up in the UK. I decided to study Chinese at university in the UK, which was quite an unusual decision to take at the time. I started my degree in 2006, and in the UK it wasn't very common to do Chinese, so there was a lot of skepticism around me doing Chinese, particularly as I was not a language student, and I'm still not really quite a language student. So yeah, I embarked on my journey almost 13 years ago now. Started off in the UK, then I moved to China for a year as part of my degree, moved back to the UK. When I finished my studying, I thought, what better place to go to put everything into action? Back to China. So then I spent 5 years living and working in China, which was an incredible experience. And then I moved back to the UK. So I've been in the UK now for about 4 years.
Right. So you started learning Chinese in university, and then you moved to China for 1 year before coming back to UK, and then you went back to China again.
Yeah, exactly. So it was part of the degree. So our university had a partnership with Nanjing University. So in the second year, we were all sent to that university to study for a year and then back to the UK.
I see. So it's kind of like an exchange study or study abroad.
Exactly.
So when you chose to learn Chinese in university, how did you come to that decision?
So I really wanted to study something that would be interesting, that would add to my skill sets, and that would help with employment opportunities when done. I was always very keen on starting my own business, and so I wanted something that would really contribute to that. I wasn't entirely sure what it would be at the time, so I looked through a number of prospectuses from universities. And I originally chose to study Japanese,
right.
But just before I started my course, I changed my mind and I thought China is probably the most exciting place then and now in terms of the change, the innovation, and just generally the opportunities. I think it's pretty different. So that's pretty much what led me to that. I also really wanted to go traveling. So I thought if I do this, then I kind of have a 2 birds, 1 stone approach. So I can study and I can go live abroad.
Yes, for sure. So while you were studying Chinese, did you realize you have made a very big decision, like that will impact you in the long term?
I think I did. I guess you mentioned long term. I think in the short term, after my first week of doing Chinese, I realized I'd made a massive decision. I didn't necessarily doubt myself, but it was so difficult at the beginning that I thought, wow, I've really chosen a very difficult degree, or at least the initial stages. But seeing as I knew nothing, I had never been to China or Asia or spoke any Chinese, so it felt really quite overwhelming at the very beginning.
So what's been your biggest motivation?
I think maybe that stems down a bit to my personality. I like a challenge, and I think when someone says that I can't do something, which happened quite a lot at the beginning of the journey of choosing to do Chinese, I had family members, even people at my school before university saying that I couldn't do it. And that really spurred me on to proving them wrong.
Right.
So that was definitely one thing. I think also, and I still believe to this day, and I guess it was confirmed when I started to work in China, that the life experience I would gain from speaking Chinese and living there and really, I guess, getting involved in Chinese society, you know, taking long train journeys and having those conversations that you wouldn't be able to have if you couldn't speak Chinese. I, at that point in time, felt, I guess it was very rewarding, and that I really was learning something and having an experience that other people couldn't relate to.
So once you start to use the language, it will definitely give you a lot of motivation. I guess the most difficult part will be at the beginner stage when you just started learning Chinese. You know, you're faced with the Chinese tones, the pronunciation, and even the characters that can be like very overwhelming for a beginner.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you say it's very motivating, and I must say that there's also times when you feel very demotivated because I'm sure people who have tried to speak Chinese as a beginner will relate to this. But when you start to speak Chinese, like if you were to go in a taxi and say 我要去什么什么的, so I want to go to somewhere, and the response you get is 你说什么我听不懂. So what are you saying? I don't understand. Because your pronunciation is so awful at the beginning, and just even the confidence that you have. I mean, I had no confidence at the begining, and so from that sometimes you'd get this response that was like, what are you saying? I don't understand. And then you'd just feel awful and really embarrassed. So you have to just really be confident and overcome that.
That's right. Have to be confident and never be afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I really think you have to just lose your inhibitions. You just have to go for it. Because if you don't go for it, certainly I felt like for me, if I didn't go for it and make all those mistakes, I would never have been able to progress.
Yes. Now, please share with us your method of learning Chinese. So what's been the most effective technical method that's been working for you?
I must say that there is no magical solution here. For me, it was time, commitment and dedication. So if I think about at the very beginning, and I had a book in front of me and I had to read characters and it was a conversation, there was no pinyin, I had no exposure to pinyin before, and I literally had to understand how to read a character and how to write a character, and that took, and still to this day takes, hours of your time. For me, I would have to sit down for hours a day and just rewrite these characters. So I would have to, if I think about ni, which is you, I would have to write it 100 times on paper and then go back and write it 100 times again. And it would be quite painful at the beginning because it felt like it doesn't matter how many hours I spend doing this and how many times I write it, I can't remember it. But I think you must switch on something in your mind, and suddenly your mind gets more used to characters and can really pick up on the detail of the character and the nuances and the radicals and all those different elements that creates the meaning. But really, in terms of how I managed to do the reading and writing, it was hours. And what I would also do, I guess later on in my learning Chinese journey, when I had to put together paragraphs and articles, I would go onto the BBC News website in Chinese and I would learn off by heart the construction of the sentences, because there are some real patterns in Chinese, I believe. You probably get the same in all languages, but it just really helped me, I guess, put together and construct a very kind of Chinese type of writing style. So that's how I did it.
Right. What about in terms of speaking and listening?
Yeah, I mean, that was really difficult because I started learning to speak, well, I started my degree in the UK. You had to really put yourself out there, so join societies and get language partners, which is a good way to start, but progress for me was very slow. And I still always felt very shy. So I think really when I started to see a massive change was when I moved to China and I was immersed in the right environment. And I wasn't sent to a first tier city. And I think after working in Shanghai, I'm not sure if I'd have done as well as I did from studying in Nanjing. So it was really about putting myself forward, getting a taxi, speaking to the taxi driver, making the mistakes. And even things like going to a bar. If you're going to the bar, you've got Chinese that are interested in talking to you. I mean, particularly at the time I was learning Chinese, it's quite unusual that you'd get Westerners speaking Chinese. They would always come and approach you and talk to you. And I embraced that opportunity as a time to talk to someone who's interested in listening to you. I guess finally, as I gained more experience in China, and I think I'd been living there for 6 months as a student, I used to take long train journeys, so overnight sleeper trains. And I actually think that if you wanted to really accelerate your Chinese learning, spend a month on sleeper trains. And I'm pretty sure that you'd finish off way in advance of everybody else because everybody wants to talk to you. For me, the experience was very safe. And people were always super lovely and wanting to talk and find out more about you and your country and culture, etc.
That's a very interesting idea, to sit on the train. I never thought, sitting on the train has so much benefit rather than, you have to kill time. But in this case, you spend the time to practice.
Yeah, of course. And there's a difference between the high-speed trains that you have in China as opposed to the long ones with the sleeper carriages. Because,
Yes.
the high-speed ones are a great experience. And of course, if you're working there, you wouldn't probably take another type of train. But that's not the type of train I mean. I'm talking about the train where, you get Chinese people from all over China taking these long journeys.
Yes. So I think it's a good idea for people, when traveling in China, and especially if people want to learn Chinese, they can, instead of take a flight, they should take a train ride.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're studying Chinese, if you don't have any time pressure, then I couldn't recommend it enough. And actually, my I guess classmates and friends later on in China all had a very similar view and experience to me, in that it was
Awesome.
very useful way of learning.
Yeah, very, very
practicing.
interesting. What a great way to talk to strangers. It's just so natural.
Absolutely.
During your study of Mandarin Chinese, what had been your biggest challenge and how did you overcome it?
So there's different stages of challenges. I think at the beginning, at the very beginning of my first month of doing my degree, I probably can't tell you how many times I cried because I found it really, really hard. And I'm not sure how university works for everybody globally, but certainly in the UK, the first year, it's challenging for some and it depends on your degree, but lots of people spend the time to socialise and join different societies. And it was still possible with Chinese, but I think the commitment you take by doing Chinese and the pressure is a bit different to some of the other degrees because you can't blag Chinese. You can't make up Chinese. And I'm not saying that you can make up philosophy, but it's just a little bit different. I mean, I'm sure you could put something on the paper for philosophy, whereas Chinese you literally can't. So that was a really challenging time. I don't really have, a secret solution for how you manage that. I think I got support from lecturers. Actually, I had I don't remember what they called it now, but you get some kind of mentor. And he was a teacher of Japanese. And he said to me, I know how hard you're finding it now, but just imagine how rewarding it will be to have a Chinese paper and be able to read it. To sit on the train or the bus or somewhere and be able to read a paper all written in Chinese characters. And I always remember that because I think that gave me that extra bit of hope and ambition that I needed to continue on. So certainly talking to people from even your classmates, because interestingly, at the beginning of my degree, obviously my classmates and I, we didn't know each other. Within those few years, we started to get to know each other very well, particularly when we lived in China. It turned out we were all going through the same, I guess, difficulties and stresses, and we were all having our own breakdowns after class because we were finding it very difficult. So I would say that if you are finding it hard, then you're not alone. And there were people that had studied Chinese before at A level or, you know, a bit, kind of like a beginner's course, and they ended up struggling because the pace of the degree was really very quick. So that's probably the first stage of difficulty. And then after that, there were times when I'd be a few years in and I couldn't quite get something to click, because people say there's no grammar in Chinese, and it's kind of right, but there is definitely a structure, and there's a way you should and shouldn't say things. So because there aren't any exact rules, that kind of makes it hard, because you can't just like learn a methodology, but there is certainly a style and a way of writing something. So again, as I said, to overcome that, I would just learn like blocks and paragraphs of writing. And finally, the other thing that helped me really understand how to use Chinese as a Chinese person would, is I would watch Chinese TV shows with subtitles, or I'd watch Chinese subtitles, or I'd watch like Friends with Mandarin subtitles. So it would give me an idea of how you express yourself in Chinese.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to overcome the grammar issues, because if you just learn the grammar and you're making up your own sentences, most often you may be speaking something that's totally different to how the native speakers say those things. But if you just imitate and learn how the native Chinese speakers speak, then you're guaranteed to be using the correct grammar, and you don't need to worry about, you know, how you're pronouncing things and things like that. If you just imitate it, you get everything right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
If you are to start learning Chinese from scratch all over again, how would you do it?
Oh, wow. Okay. It's a good question, because I feel like, I guess I could think, what is the next language I'd like to learn? And that'd be Spanish. So it's how would I do that differently to how I did Chinese? So I think as a step one, I would just want to go straight out to the country and just completely immerse myself in that. So I would probably try and enroll into a Chinese language course, but at a university in China. I think you might get better value for money if you do it that way. And the classes and the time is probably a bit more intensive. And what I would also do is I would avoid first and maybe second tier cities, or I guess you could say the smaller the city is, the more likely you are to have to speak Chinese. Because if I were to go to Shanghai now and do a Chinese language course or something, I would actually worry that I would not put myself out there as much as I could do. I maybe wouldn't challenge myself as much. So I would, I guess just further away from the coast really. But there's lots of amazing cities in China. So that would be my other piece of advice. I actually had a friend that I met in China, an American guy, and he ended up doing quite a lot on Chinese TV, and I think he still does Chinese TV back in America now. And his Chinese, so it was quite interesting because when he first moved to China, he thought I had great Chinese, and he was he was always very complimentary towards my Chinese. And then he decided that he had to go live somewhere in Anhui in a farm and live with a Chinese family, because he found that was the only way that he could really progress his Chinese quickly. Yeah. Wow. So it's quite a major move. And I can't remember exactly for how long he lived there. It could have been months, but his Chinese is incredible. It is incredible. Obviously, he's been using it a lot since he did that, but if you really want to immerse yourself in this, then there are lots of ways of doing it. It just depends on yourself really, and what you feel comfortable with.
I think that's a good advice, just to basically immerse yourself as much as possible, and not just by immersing yourself in China, but also make sure you are in the right environment to to force yourself to speak. Otherwise, you could be living in China, but still speaking English and hearing English every single day.
Yeah, I worked in Shanghai for 4 or 5 years, and I had a lot of friends that were doing various different things. So English teachers, an obvious one. I'm trying to think of some of those. I think they were mainly English teachers, and they all had the ambition to learn Chinese, but they could literally get through their 1 year, 2 years of living there without speaking Chinese. I mean, the only thing that you might need it for is for the taxi, but you can show them the address. And I had a few friends that would call me up and ask me to speak to the taxi driver. So there are always ways of getting around it. So I think, yeah, you're completely right in your point. And I had people that just didn't speak a word of it, and they didn't really have to. I mean, life was harder for them. It's a bit more frustrating, but they didn't have to.
Well, now, Hannah, please share with us a success story, a most rewarding moment after you have become fluent in Chinese.
I worked in China when I finished my degree, and then I joined a consultancy, and we had to use Chinese all the time. So we'd have to use Chinese to talk about very specific technologies and products with this consultancy I joined. And it was always super rewarding when I had CEOs come out from these big tech startups in Silicon Valley, and they'd be relying on you to do their whole week's worth of negotiations or introductions, business introductions, perhaps a sales pitch, and that is certainly very rewarding.
That also gives you a lot of opportunities, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of opportunities, a lot of exposure.
So what are you doing with your Chinese now? You're now living in London, right?
Yes, so I am working for the Body Shop, and the Body Shop is not in China. It's more around some of the animal testing regulations that exist in the market. And the Body Shop is someone that tries to make changes around animal testing and is very much against animal testing. So we are kind of championing alternative testing methods in cosmetics. So my job here is around working together between Chinese officials and the Body Shop, and seeing how they can how we can help support change in markets. And also, our products are really popular with Chinese. I mean, super popular. Some of our key stores in London, I think we get sometimes 50% of our customers are Chinese. So. Wow. Yeah, we have a huge following. So the other part is around understanding how we target the Chinese customer, how we can talk about our products in a way that's relevant for them and makes sense for them, introducing Chinese payment methods like Alipay, and just generally understanding how we can build up the right kind of, engagement with them online, like Weibo and WeChat. So it's quite big, and it's a forever evolving beast.
Yeah, I guess not only being able to speak Chinese that benefits you in terms of doing business with Chinese customer, I guess also being able to understand the Chinese culture, that also helps you with your work.
Yeah, I actually think understanding the Chinese culture is a massive part of it, and trying to link that to language. I think if you live in China and you don't speak Chinese, yeah, you'll know a bit about China. You'll know a lot about China. Certainly, I think speaking Chinese, you can really understand how Chinese people think, and you can really understand more about the culture, the history, and a lot of just interactions you have and what that actually means when you speak Chinese. So certainly that helps. But it's it's interesting because I work with Western colleagues, and I try to get them to understand and to tell them what I know, and that is always a challenge.
Yes. Do you still have chance to speak Chinese nowadays?
Yeah, I do. So depending on what's going on, I mean, I still go to China and take trips to China. I was recently doing a project where we were working out the best Chinese translations for our product ranges. So a lot of Chinese used then. I would certainly like to use more Chinese than I do, but the reality is I live in London. So apart from joining particular groups or building up a friendship circle, you're not in the same environment.
Yes. How would you compare your life before you've learned Chinese and your life after you have learned Chinese?
Richer? But yeah, I mean, before I learned Chinese, I was a lot younger, so it's kind of hard to say, but certainly richer, and it's very rewarding. So you feel quite accomplished, and I guess it's bigger than a party trick you can pull out. It's quite a unique skill that certainly in the UK not many people have.
Yes, yes. Cool. So can you share with us one special thing about the Chinese culture that is different to your own culture?
So I think that Chinese are very hospitable. So I think British people are nice. We're quite different. We can come across quite cold initially. I have had the warmest, most welcoming of, I guess, introductions or simply just coming across Chinese people than I've had anywhere else. So if I just take the example of long distance train journeys, and I remember I met a group of Chinese people, and we'd all met for the first time on this train, and we were going from Guangzhou to Chengdu, and by the end of the train, this lady wanted us to get off, and she invited us over for dinner, and then this guy thought it was a brilliant idea, so he paid for a hotel room for me so I could come and stay before going on to my next destination, and it was just incredible, and that was one really amazing experience. But then also right throughout my whole working time, when I had Chinese clients or prospects, and we were meeting, and they always want to take you out for lunch or for dinner, and they want to get to know you, and I think that's really a very charming part of Chinese culture.
Yes, I agree. Having the manner and treating people well, that's definitely one of the culture thing in China. Like I personally grew up, getting influenced by that culture as well. When guests comes, you always treat them with the best. It's just how Chinese think.
Yes, exactly.
What's your favorite city in China?
I have a few. And I like them all for different reasons. I think I love Shanghai because I spent so long there. And I know it's very cosmopolitan. I know it's very international. But I love that about it because it's still very Chinese. And it has, I think, quite a fascinating history. And there's some really amazing architecture that you get there. I think Beijing is also fascinating. There's a real feel of being in China when you're in Beijing, and the amazing, I guess, historical sites that you have, and the Great Wall and all the obvious ones, Tiananmen Square, are fantastic, and the people are slightly different, and there's a lot of like grassroots music culture and pop culture and fashion, and I think that's very Chinese and very interesting. And then I love parts like Chengdu. And they're, I guess, quite gentle and very much around the nature and the environment. And you've got like the passion for mahjong, which is the game they play, and drinking tea in the afternoon. And so it's a very different pace to what you get in Shanghai and Beijing. But it's very nice.
Awesome. That's a very good description of the, you have summed up all three cities very nicely. Is there a tool, an app, or a website that you cannot live without in learning Chinese?
Ooh. In learning Chinese language.
Yeah. Or maybe the Chinese culture.
Yeah. When I was learning Chinese, we didn't have smartphones. So, I mean, there are apps that are out there now that I'm sure are great, but I don't use any of them to learn Chinese. I have a dictionary in my phone called Pleco because I was told it was very good.
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't have any... I mean, I really learned Chinese in a very kind of like traditional way of learning a language. Like I said, I would watch TV shows, and I would read the BBC News in Chinese. So those are my... Actually, when we first started learning Chinese, we had this really awful red book And some of the language in that book and some of the conversations were really odd. Some of the words were very peculiar. So even the materials we had at the very beginning went fantastic. So those are the things that I relied on in learning Chinese. But I think there's loads of things out there. Actually, there is one company that I came across a few years ago called Memorize. And the founder of this business has a background in China. So he knows a lot around learning Chinese and being in China. So I think that might be another interesting tool.
Cool. Pleco and Memorize. These two are actually very popular apps. Also most mentioned by our guest in our show.
Oh, great.
So,
Brilliant.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised you mentioning these two apps. They're definitely great apps to have.
Great.
So if you are to recommend to our listeners one book in learning Chinese or the Chinese culture, what would that be?
Yeah, so I actually have a slightly different recommendation. So it's not a book, but it's a publication that comes out every week. It's called Week in China, and it's sponsored by HSBC. And the website is simply www.weekinchina.com, and you can sign up there. And they release articles every week, and they focus on all different types of sectors, and there's all different types of features on there. So you've got stuff from like China and the world, economy, internet and tech, society, Chinese consumers, entertainment, sport, everything. So for me, I find that a fantastic read, and it's a great way to stay on top of everything that's changing in China.
Great, that's very interesting. I'll definitely link that in our show notes. Now this is your chance to teach our listeners your favorite Chinese quote, phrase, or expression.
Yeah, okay. So mine's, I guess, a funny one in terms of how it was used and where I used to hear it. So the quote is "Long Fei Feng Wu," and it's flying dragon. Yeah, it's flying dragon, dancing phoenix. But actually, what it really means is kind of beautiful and artful. And it's interesting because this idiom was used in our, I guess, the infamous Red Book that we had to learn Chinese from in our first year at university. And we all thought it was a really odd thing to have there. We didn't really get it. We didn't really know what to do with it, but we had to use it. And then when we went to China for our first year, my friend's Chinese name was Li Long something, and every time he'd say the long, he'd say Mu Zili de Li, and then he would go Long Fei Feng Wu de Wu the long. Anyway, he used to say this idiom every time he used to try and explain what characters were in his name. So this just always used to stick with us, and to this day we always have a little joke about it. But there you go, that's my one for you.
Yeah, that's actually a funny phrase. 龙飞凤舞. I think it's a phrase to describe, for example, when people dancing, like very fancy dance, you can use this phrase. You can say 龙飞凤舞. Or, even when people are writing Chinese characters, you can also say 龙飞凤舞. It means, it's basically a way to praise a person's writing. It looks really handsome, really beautiful. You can use this phrase. And the other thing I want to say is, when your friend, introduced people about his name, he used this phrase. This is a very interesting point to raise, because when you're trying to explain to people which character your name is, you see, this is a trouble Chinese people are facing. People speaking English, you never have this problem, because, if my name is Victor, I never have to explain to people Victor is what, Victor. But, if you have a Chinese name, it's so easy to have so many different characters with the same pronunciation. So in this case, you have to explain to people which character it is. And when people trying to explain that to people, they always use a good phrase. They always use a fancy word that people will appreciate, rather than using a weird one. 龙飞凤舞 is definitely a good phrase. That's why your friends use that phrase to explain his name to make people make the connection between this phrase and himself. So basically, this is for our listeners. If you have a Chinese name, and when you are trying to explain which character your name is to your Chinese friend, make sure you think of some nice Chinese phrases that can be associated to you. And you can just explain that to them, and your Chinese friend will be impressed.
Yeah.
All right, now, Hannah, if you are to give our listeners one single piece of advice in learning Chinese, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I've said a few things, so nothing new here, but stay committed, stay strong, keep trying, and put the time into it, because you can't just want it. You need to really try hard at it.
That's a great advice. Just before we let you go, how can our listeners reach you?
So maybe LinkedIn's the best way.
I'll definitely link that in our show notes. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for your time today, sharing with our listeners your journey in learning Chinese. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Cheers, Victor.
To our listeners, the show note is now available at ChineseTalkEase.com/31. TalkEase is spelled as TalkEze. This podcast is created for you. I'd love to hear your feedback of this show, both good and bad. I'd also like to hear about your biggest problem in learning Chinese, so that maybe I can help you to overcome it. You can do so by visiting ChineseTalkEase.com/feedback. Want to expand your vocabulary? Find me on Instagram at Chinese Talk Ease, where I teach one Chinese word a day. You can also join us on Facebook. Just go to talkchinesecommunity.com. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next episode.